During the Victorian era in England, young men of at least the upper middle class embarked upon journeys to the continent. As a capstone to a young man's education, which included intensive study of the classics, the Grand Tour served to culture young men before they assumed dynamic roles in British society. Englishmen mainly traveled throughout France, Germany, and Switzerland before arriving in Italy, which was often considered the goal destination of the trip. After embarking from his home country, often for the first time, a grand tourist would spend a few years of his life immersing himself in various European cultures and, hopefully, connecting his studies at home with what he was witnessing abroad.
9 months in this delicious country have done more for me than all the sage lessons which books, or men formed by books, could have taught me. It was my imagination that needed correction, and nothing but travel could have produced this effect.
I feel like we spent the last 4 years studying ancient texts and not really having a lot of context to put it in. I mean, the teacher was really in the classroom. Mr. Unger especially, he makes it come alive with his games and his factions and everything. But going to Rome, really, you could see where they lived, you could see how they lived, you could see the social classes, you could see their, like, we had just been reading their literature. When we went to Rome, we could see the whole world, so.
The tradition of the Grand Tour has undergone many transformations since its birthplace in England. Technological improvements made it more affordable for the middle class to travel to the continent, and British women broke age-old gender barriers by embarking upon their own travels. The custom even migrated to the United States, as young men and women began to cross the Atlantic to perceive the cities that pervaded their studies of Latin and ancient Greek. Although the study of the classics has declined since the Victorian era, the revered tradition of the Grand Tour has proven the permanence of the classics in modern society. Without a classical education, it would be virtually impossible for one to understand the everlasting presence of these ancient civilizations.
Well, I think in terms of classical studies, probably the most important thing is that they're actually seeing some of the places that they and some of the monuments that are the background or even directly involved in some of the literature that they've been reading. I think gives them a sort of picture, a bigger picture of the classical world that they've been studying, and also because our classes tend to be very focused on the language and literature, that the trip is an opportunity to learn more about Roman history and culture and fill in a lot that doesn't show up, say, in the Ciceronian oration or Virgilians.
Although the term Grand Tour was not published until 1670, the first documented trip was undertaken by Thomas Coriat. Born in Somersetshire around 1577, Coriat had excelled in the study of the classics at Gloucester Hall, Oxford, where he once delivered an impressive oration to the visiting Queen Elizabeth. He was received by Prince Henry of Wales, and with his blessing left Britain for the continent on May 14, 1608.
For the short time I was abroad, I observed more solid matters than any English man did in the like space this long time. I saw infinite abundance of walnut trees in that part of Piemont, and wonderful plenty of corn, especially rye, and a marvellous evanescence and plainness of the ground for a great space, and store of vines that grow not so long as in France, but upon high poles or rails, a great deal higher from the ground. Knowledge of foreign languages, which the shortness of time did not afford me, acquired by industrious travel, yieldeth an ornament beyond all comparison, the most precious and excellent that can be incident to a gentleman. For if the learning of two languages be commended by Ovid, who said, Nec levis ingenua spectus coluisse per artes curassit, et linguas eredices duas. Much more praise doth he deserve that by travelling in France, Italy, Spain, Alemanni, and the Netherlands, doth learn the 5 languages of those noble countries, which being added to his own mother tongue and the Latin, do answer the number of the 7 liberal sciences.
On Easter I was in St. Peter's, and in that superb temple I saw noble and mystical adorations offered to the Supreme Being. I was penetrated with devotion. I was sure that the revelation given by Jesus was true. I was never more nobly happy than on that day.
When we went into the Sistine Chapel, God, like, that ceiling defies every sort of description, and I just kind of lost myself in there for an hour.
Probably the most memorable moment was the day that we went to the Vatican and all those other places, because I mean during the day it was just so, you just wouldn't stop walking. It was going. But then I remember getting to the top of St. Peter's. That was probably the best moment of the whole trip, because there were so many stairs, there was so much walking, and I was just like, I was ready to just like sit down and like not move, but everyone like just, the teachers like were like, no, come on, we have to get to the top. So it was all spiraling, it was pretty scary, but when we got to the top we could see all of Rome, and it was just so amazing. We could see like all the places where the streets were still ancient roads. We could see ancient monuments mixed with modern architecture, and I thought it was beautiful, and that was probably the best part.
The eager grand tourist often traveled with a tutor, whose duty was not only to educate the student, but also to guide him morally, so that he would return home a cultured, well-regarded young adult.
Well, I suppose most of what I did was giving presentations, I suppose, so trying to point out what I find interesting or beautiful or important about the places and the monuments that we visited.
I mean, if there weren't those teachers, then it wouldn't have been any fun, right? Like, these are people, that I've known for a while now, and I love all of them. So, and like they know everything. Like each one of them has like the feel that they all know. Like Mr. Langford knows his churches, and like Miss Morris knows, just like Rome like the back of her hand, right? And Mr. Unger knows all like the traditions and everything. And I mean, without them, it would have been insane.
I remember Mr. Hartnett's talk at the Circus Maximus. If we had been there without him, it would have just been a field. But he really brought it alive with his stories, his poems, all of his poems, with his iPad display of what it had looked like.
When I'm on the trip with my colleagues in this situation, I tend to take on the role of an organizer, in part because I love speaking Italian so much. And I want to share some of that modern connection with the students while I'm there. I like them to meet the people that I've met along the way, to see how important our relationship is with the cook in the convent, for example, Tiziana.
Then we went to the Capitoline Hill. We climbed on the roof of the modern Senate, from which Mr. Morrison pointed out ancient Rome on its 7 hills. He showed me a little map of it, and read me a clear summary of the growth of this famous city to its present extent. I viewed the celebrated forum. I experienced sublime and melancholy emotions as I thought of all the great affairs which had taken place there, and saw the place now all in ruins, with the wretched huts of the carpenters and other artisans occupying the site of that rostrum from which Cicero had flung forth his stunning eloquence. We entered the famous Colosseum, which certainly presents a vast and sublime idea of the grandeur of the ancient Romans. It is hard to tell whether the astonishing massiveness or the exquisite taste of this superb building should be more admired. We walked to where the house of Cicero had stood. A statue there resembles him a great deal. Struck by these famous places, I was seized with enthusiasm. I began to speak Latin. Mr. Morrison replied. He laughed a bit at the beginning, but we made a resolution to speak Latin continually during this course of antiquities. We have persisted, and every day we speak with greater facility, so that when we have harangued on Roman antiquities in the language of the Romans themselves, we saw a fragment of the temple Jupiter Tonans, which is architecturally very handsome. We saw in a church the famous Tullia prison, from which Sallust gives so hideous a picture, and where Paul and Silas were imprisoned. Catholics say Peter and Paul. They show a stone against which the head of the Prince of Apostles was dashed. The mark remains very distinct. We saw the hole down which criminals were thrown, the stone to which the two apostles were chained. I was very curious, and because I moved from one scene to another, melancholy never had time to weigh me down greatly. I was struck with everything. I had the agreeable sensation that derives from a half-knowledge of things. To many minds, perhaps a great of pleasure as knowing them thoroughly.
After visiting Rome, most grand tourists ventured south to the Bay of Naples, where they would wander through the ancient ruins of Pompeii. Tourists visited the shops, public forums, and homes of Romans, whose lives were suddenly buried under the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. Since Pompeii is constantly being excavated, each visitor saw something a little different.
I always had an idea that you went into Pompeii with torches, by the way of damp, dark stairways, just as you do in silver mines, and traversed gloomy tunnels with lava overhead, and something on either hand like dilapidated prisons, gouged out of the solid earth, that faintly resembled houses. But you do nothing of the kind. Fully one half of the buried city, perhaps, is completely exhumed and thrown open freely to the light of day. And there stands the long rows of solidly built brick houses, roofless, just as they stood 1,800 years ago, hot with the flaming sun. And there lie their floors, clean swept, and not a bright fragment tarnished or wanting of the labored mosaics that pictured them with the beasts and birds and flowers which we copy in perishable carpets today. And there are the narrow streets and narrower sidewalks, paved with flags of good hard lava, the one deeply rutted with the chariot wheels, and the other with the passing feet of the Pompeians of bygone centuries. And there are the bake shops, the temples, the halls of justice, the baths, the theaters, all clean scraped and neat and suggesting nothing of the nature of a silver mine, away down in the bowels of the earth. No, Pompeii is no longer a buried city. It is a city of hundreds and hundreds of roofless houses, and a tangled maze of streets where one could easily get lost without a guide and have to sleep in some ghostly palace that had known no living tenant since that awful November night of 18 centuries ago. We went up a long street and stood in the broad court of the Forum of Justice. The floor was level and clean, and up and down either side was a noble colonnade of broken pillars, with their beautiful Ionic and Corinthian columns scattered about them. At the upper end were the vacant seats of the judges. It was a quaint and curious pastime, wandering through this old silent city of the dead, lounging through utterly deserted streets where 100,000 human beings once bought and sold and walked and rode and made the place resound with the noise and confusion of traffic and pleasure. I entered the theater and sat down in one of the long rows of stone benches in the dress circle and looked at the place for the orchestra and the ruined stage and around at the wide sweep of empty boxes. I tried to imagine the music in full blast. Everywhere around are things that reveal to you something of the customs and history of this forgotten people. But what would a volcano leave of an American city if it once got after it? Not a sign or symbol to tell its story.
Other popular destinations around the Bay of Naples included Pestum, Cumae, and Baia.
Off an hour after sunrise, one radiant morning in a little boat. There was not a cloud in the sky, nor a wave upon the sea, which was so translucent that you could see the hollow caverns clothed with the glaucous sea moss, and the leaves and branches of those delicate weeds that pave the unequal bottom of the water. We then coasted to the Bay of Baia to the left, in which we saw many picturesque and interesting ruins. But I have to remark that whenever we disembarked, we were disappointed, while from the boat the effect of the scenery was inexpressibly delightful. We passed through the cavern of the Sibyl, not Virgil's Sibyl, which pierces one of the hills which circumscribe the lake, and came to a calm and lovely basin of water, surrounded by dark woody hills and profoundly solitary. Some vast ruins of the Temple of Pluto stand on a lawny hill on the one side of it, and are reflected in its windless mirror. It is far more beautiful than the Elysian Fields.
In Paestum, students had the opportunity to see the well-preserved Greek temples, and using their knowledge from the classroom, reenacted an ancient Greek sacrifice.
Hydromen, O Philoi!
Rejoice, O friends!
Hydromen, O Philoi!
Rejoice, O friends!
Hydromen, O Philoi! 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 Hydromen, O Philoi!
Theoi, genoiste, apatropoi, paton.
O gods, turn away evils!
Euphemia sto.
Let no one speak an ill-omened word.
I comment Elphistai, Agathon.
For it is good to pray.
Usate, dexamenai, Dusian kai tois hieroise, carestai.
Here, receiving the sacrifice and rejoicing in the right.
Kairete technadios, date demeros san aoiden. Cleate athanaton hieron genos ayen eonton.
Hail, children of Zeus! Grant lovely song and celebrate the holy race of the deathless gods who are forever.
Zeu! Kudiste, megiste, kai, athanatoi, theoi aloi. Elfthete kai, nun o theoi.
Zeus, all powerful and greatest, and the rest of the immortal gods, come now, O gods.
Elthete kai nun o theoi.
Come now, O gods.
Elthete kai nun o theoi. Oitenes este.
Come now, O gods, whoever you are.
Eufron elthete macares, kecharismena dierpa dexaste.
Come propitiously, blessed ones, and accept the delightful offerings.
Ye pion, ye pion, ye pion, Kairomen.
Hydromen!
Let us rejoice.
Ye pion, ye pion,
Ye Payon! 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 I have his ears.
Yay, Tyone!
I need one.
Give me a leg.
So amphitheater? Yeah, but I mean both. For both functions. Oh, because they didn't have
When we were in Rome this spring break with the Exeter students, there were 2 times when I saw some of the students realizing that that is the spot where Cicero probably delivered his oration against Catiline, and over there is the spot where the conspirators were killed. And they kind of put 2 and 2 together, and they looked up at the Capitoline Hill where the temple was, and got that whole sense of the enclosed space between the hills, and they're just like, wow, this is where it happened. And that, like, wow, is the thing that I look for when we go on this trip, and makes me feel really good about taking people there. Another thing that I notice when we go is, like, just even coming down from the convent the first day, walking down the hill, saying, keep your eyes peeled, keep looking straight ahead, and the first thing that popped up over the horizon was the top of the Colosseum, and the gasps of awe from the students behind me. You know, it's just exactly the reason that I want to do this trip.
The greatest pleasure I took in my journey was in seeing the fields, towns, and rivers that have been described by so many classical authors, and have been the scenes of so many great actions. It is worthwhile to have an eye on Horace's voyage to Brindisi when one passes this way, for by comparing his several stages in the road he took with those that are observed at present, we may have some idea of the changes that have been made in the face of his country since his time. From this poet's description of his voyage, we may conclude they seldom went above 14 miles a day over the Appian Way, which was more used by the noble Romans than any other in Italy, as it led to Naples, Baia, and the most delightful parts of the nation. It is indeed very disagreeable to be carried in haste over this pavement. For to quick travellers 'tis a tedious road, but if you walk but slow 'tis pretty good. Horace from Satire 5.
If a man's mind never failed to catch the spirit of the climate in which he breathes, I ought now to write you a most precious letter, for Naples is indeed a delicious spot. Praeter omnes ridet. I have been near 3 weeks here, and have been constantly employed in seeing the classical places all around. Is it possible to conceive a richer scene than the finer bay diversified with islands and bordered by fields where Virgil's muses charmed the creation, where the renown of ancient Rome enjoyed the luxury of glorious retreat, and the true flow of soul which they valued as much as triumphs?
Before leaving the motherland for foreign terrains, a grand tourist had to be well prepared. Travelers needed weapons, protection against lice and other varmints, clothing for varying climates, and familiar food and medicine. In the past, they entertained themselves with writing and drawing supplies. 21st century grand tourists also travel with modern technology as both a convenience and a comfort. Transportation has usually been an unappealing aspect of the grand tour. Bad roads, unpredictable seas, and weather often made traversing from one location to another a miserable experience. Usually, sightseers utilized mules, but the wealthier were carried by laborers in covered seats. Although modern advances allowed 21st century tourists more relaxing flights, buses, trains, and subways, trekking down the roads and through alleyways was an extremely exhausting affair.
I think probably the most difficult thing was living in the nunnery, just because there were just a lot of different customs, there was a dress code there, and then it is hard to like live or visit a country where you don't know the language. But luckily, 2 of our teachers spoke Italian, and that was amazing. So
Passing through customs was never an easy task. Because Italy was not unified until the 19th century, travelers were searched and were forced to exchange money every time they passed into a different kingdom. The British were advised to trust no one. Protestants had to hide their religious views while within papal territories, and thieves waited alongside the roads for the unprepared and inattentive.
We want to go to Athens, Constantinople, Thebes, the pyramids, and the Holy Land, and we want to go with a good name. How can we even go at all if the people in these countries gather the impression that we are a gigantic exterminating expedition whose mission it is to kill all we can with cholera and finish the rest with a stench so atrocious that only such as are educated to it can hope to smell and survive?
Lodging while on the road was nowhere nearly as plush as home. The sheets on uncomfortable beds were often dirty and filled with bedbugs, and sometimes the only room available was in a barn. Usually, the wealthy found better accommodations in the metropolitan areas or within private homes.
I have so often mentioned the inns on the roads in Italy to be the worst in the world, that I am tired of repeating the same thing. Yet I must tell you of this one peculiar in that style. The walls are bare, the pavement nearly as rugged as the dirty roads we had just passed. No sashes in the window, no glass, no paper, but some shutters so out of repair as to admit through their breaches in the rain, and snow upon our beds. The doors could not be shut. Our beds were made of knots of hemp, without curtains, and their vicinity to the wall was an aggravation of our wretched plight. It being in a manner plastered over a snuffy spittle, and marbled between entresais, with what I cannot mention. The only light in the inn afforded was that of a stinking lamp supplied with train oil.
Grand tourists often recorded in their journals that they would take the day off from sightseeing or socializing to sleep and relax.
I think that at the time, I didn't like that we didn't really get a break during the day, but now looking back on it, I think it was definitely worth it. I think it was definitely worth, keep moving. So, and I think it was, and like if we had taken more breaks, we wouldn't have gotten to see all we got to see. And in those 2 weeks, we got to see so much.
You can hang around anywhere, but you can only see these things on the short time that you're in Rome. So let's carpe diem and see it as much as we can.
'17th and 18th century grand tourists mingled with their Italian counterparts to varying degrees. The influx of foreigners helped boost the economy, and guests and locals had the opportunity to learn from one another.
Great propriety of manner, with much wit and cheerfulness, characterized the Roman society. The Romans, more than any people I have ever known, followed the maxim of never interfering with the habits and customs, the pleasure or even the prejudices of others. Live and let live was their practice, no less than their principle. And this had a happy influence in staying the progress of scandal, which was certainly less prevalent at Rome than in most places. But what I particularly admired about the society there was, the character was so justly estimated. The Romans had wonderful tact and penetration in discovering and appreciating the merit of their fellow citizens, and also of strangers whom they had an opportunity of knowing, either personally or from their works or actions. They weighed everything, and their judgment was very correct.
Well, what I would say about what my role is I feel like I'm the bridge between the ancient and the modern, that, and in some ways, and that's reflected in what I studied as a student myself, with philosophy and English wanting to go deeper and deeper back into the past, and then when I got to the past, wanting to bring it back to the future again. So when I'm in Rome with students, one of the things that I love about it is the layering of the city itself, that we're walking on a modern street, and right underneath us is the Cloaca Maxima, and right under that is the geology of Rome that made these hills and these rivers and these streams. And then speaking Italian is a lot of fun, because it sounds like we imagine perhaps the Romans were speaking, only with a few changes. And you can see the third declension noun ablative case going right over into nouns in Italian, and that's a lot of fun to do. So we've got the language, we've got the landscape, and then in the storytelling we also have all of the artwork that was inspired by the people who studied and lived and worked in Italy or France or Germany, all there in the museums around us, hearkening back to the classics and trying to take what was great and noble about the classical world and inspire people of their generation, and that has inspired us further on. So looking at both Renaissance art, later art, modern art, with the backdrop of the classical, it's magical.
Oh, I mean, during the meal times, yeah, I loved that.
Italian food also received varying levels of praise and criticism from those who were strangers to Italian customs. Breakfast is scanty in Italy, not usually consisting of much more than cold bread and bland butter. Dinner is usually a well-appreciated time in Italian society. This meal tended to last for hours, with endless courses brought before the hungry.
And thus he goes on, from dish to dish, like a boy after a butterfly, which just misses getting caught every time it alights, but somehow doesn't get caught after all.
The accommodation here is bad and very dear. Our supper consisted of a soup, the chief ingredients of which were all sorts of livers, gizzards, collected from various birds of various dates, failing after each, other in muddy pool, very unlike the lake of Bolsena, broiled pigeons with oil, and a fricture of livers, etc.
Foreigners cannot enjoy our food, I suppose, any more than we can enjoy theirs. It is not strange, for tastes are made, not born.
The young travelers often abused the privilege of going abroad by living licentiously and decadently. Despite the dangers of sexually transmitted diseases and illegitimate children, the grand tourists were known to engage in numerous romantic affairs with both foreigners and their fellow countrymen and women. The tourists also recklessly spent their money on drinking and gambling. These young adults clearly enjoyed their independence from their homeland's social standards, even though it detracted from their studies of the Italian topography. Grand tourists spent a considerable amount of time with fellow Englishmen. Many flocked to the homes of nobles living abroad. It was relieving for some to be able to converse with their own kind.
I feel like we weren't really immersed in Italian culture so much. I mean, at the villa, maybe a little bit, but I mean, we didn't speak Italian. We didn't really pal around with any Italians. We were pretty ostentatiously tourists. So, I mean, getting a view of it was pretty cool. Seeing, I don't know, their ads, getting a sense of how they talk just from hearing it, getting a couple words from how much to talk to people was definitely really cool, definitely different, and something I'd really like to look into sometime in my life.
Culture-wise, besides, being at the dining table and just walking around, there wasn't that much, and especially because of some of the customs we didn't know, but I think, I loved it. I want to go back and live for a little while. The street vendors are kind of really good.
By the end of the grand tour, some were happy to return home.
I was glad to get home, immeasurably glad. So glad, in fact, that it did not seem possible that anything could ever get me out of the country again. Europe has many advantages which we have not, but they do not compensate for a good many still more valuable ones which exist nowhere but in our own country.
The grand tour was generally considered a masculine affair, but by 1798, women decided that they also had the right to travel to the continent. British society was suffocating for women, for social pressures forced them to remain in the home. Women did not look upon the Grand Tour as a method of getting ahead in society. Leaving their homeland gave them a time to reflect, express their ideals, views, and opinions honestly and accurately.
Strongly impressed as I was that honor, truth, and virtue were the only roads to happiness, and that the love and consideration of my fellow creatures, and the society in which I was about to live, depended entirely upon my own conduct and exertions. The whole powers of my mind were devoted into doing always what I thought right, and you would be safe, without a consideration of what I knew would be agreeable, while I had at the same time the most lively sense of everything that was brilliant and distinguished, and the greatest desire to distinguish myself.
Although some men did not understand why a woman needed to go abroad, others were impressed by the knowledge of a female Grand Tourist and saw women's travels as a beneficial educational opportunity. While in Italy, women wrote letters to friends and drew the landscapes and landmarks they witnessed. Some called on nunneries to see what was so appealing about living in a cloistered existence. By the end of the trip, some women favored Italian culture more than their lives at home. The Italian women were more liberated from societal standards and could freely articulate their views. Although Americans like Mark Twain traveled to the continent, the Grand Tour grew not to be as trendy of an affair, mainly because of a waning interest in the classics. Many public and college preparatory schools had offered Latin or even required it for graduation, but these institutions began to abolish their Latin requirements in order to offer students more opportunities to study other disciplines. In the 1940s, Phillips Exeter Academy began to debate whether they should drop the 2-year classical language requirement, which most boys fulfilled by taking Latin. In the winter of 1947, the faculty voted to restructure the school's core curriculum, and, as a result, students were no longer required to study the classics.
Needless to say, these changes were not made either to displace the ancient classics or to focus attention on modern languages or science. It is hoped and believed that the many excellent grounds for studying the classics will continue to attract students in nearly the same numbers as before, and for better reasons. This has been the experience at certain other schools where Latin has become an elective.
The majority of the students at the Academy balked at this decision. Students spoke out against the faculty's decision because they saw the benefits of a classical education. The Exonian, the student newspaper of the Academy, published a front-page editorial signed by the editor-in-chief, John Cowles, Jr., expressing the students' appreciation for the classics as a fundamental academic foundation.
We believe that the faculty have so altered the curriculum, have so distorted Exeter's function in the service of education, that if this present course is continued, Exeter shall soon cease to represent and teach that great liberal education which is its heritage. The value of secondary school education lies in the fact that at this level, a boy acquires a broad cultural foundation upon which he may, in his college years, build his chosen profession. The classic languages, Latin and Greek, do not deal with irregularities in syntax. They deal with abstract thoughts and ideas, with the culture of a civilization whose refinements often surpassed our own. We believe that a boy must keep his education in secondary school as broad and general in the realm of ideas as possible, so that he may have a firm cultural and philosophical foundation upon which later, in college, he may build his profession in a specialized field. The ancient languages are one foremost means by which a boy at Exeter can acquire this foundation.
Alums also penned editorials for the paper expressing how the classics influenced their lives.
Now I realize that, of all the courses I studied at Exeter, Latin gave me the most solid benefit and satisfaction. Here was the logical preciseness of mathematics, the music of poetry, the facts of history, the literature of a nation, all in one package. It enabled me to critically analyze what is said in a book. It gave me a fleeting glimpse of true scholarship. Not only did we study a text, but we studied interpretations of the text, how the text came into being, and compared the text with similar works of the same and different eras. With a background of this sort, the approach to college studies becomes less difficult. The student realizes that education is more than the memorization and recitation of facts and formulas.
The trustees of the Academy, who did not question the faculty's decision, were also well aware of the field's declining popularity.
Many, perhaps most of the trustees believe as I do that the study of Latin and Greek is of greatest importance in the education and training of America's youth. I regret that constantly diminishing numbers of students in our American schools and colleges are seeking to study the classical languages, and that fewer courses are being offered in such languages.
Current classics students, like those who were appalled by the drop of the Latin requirement, recognize the benefits of their academic endeavors. A classical education opens one's eyes to the influences these remarkable civilizations had on the evolution of mankind. After studying Latin and Greek language and literature, and after witnessing the remarkable accomplishments of those who lived in Italy centuries before, a grand tourist was able to recognize the remnants of the classics in their own lives. It is hard to argue that these civilizations have not had a significant impact on linguistics, literature, art, architecture, politics, and philosophy.
Oh, it changed my life completely, because once you come and you see these things, and you guys are very lucky to be here to do this kind of stuff so young, it really does change your entire perception of things, because you finally see the spaces. You can actually then sort of measure yourself against the ancient Romans for the first time on a sort of real visceral level. So, and be able to see the languages written out before you on the inscriptions, step on the materials, touch them, see the spaces, see even the light. I mean, there's a great quote that I got from a letter of Cicero that I read years and years and years ago, where he says, he talks to his friend Rufus, and he says something like, urbem incole mi rufe, et vive in ista luce. That's what he says, and I say it in sort of an Italian way. He says, live in the city, Rufus, the city, and live in that light. And you guys can finally see what the Mediterranean light is like here. There really is a quality to the light in a place like Rome that has inspired artists, sculptors, all throughout the centuries that you can't appreciate till you come here. It's unlike anything else. So, yeah, the point is really you need to be here.
I learned a lot about the history. I learned a lot about why I'm taking Latin. I learned to love the classics quite a bit more and to appreciate kind of the people behind the scenes. The teachers aren't just these robots, machines teaching us. They're actual people, and they're really cool and really smart. And I learned what classics can do for you.
Well, I think there were definitely parts that I learned to, parts that I've read that I learned to appreciate more. For example, when we went into the Sibyl's cave, holy crap, that was mind-blowing. And it's like a simple cave, it's not like it's amazing, but I was talking to Mr. Unger, and he was like, yeah, I can really feel the Newman here. And that was so powerful. And I think, education-wise, learning the city, knowing where things stand, and Brian and I are reading Livy right now, and Mr. Langford often pulls out a map of Rome, and he explains this, this happened here, this happened there, and it's just kind of cool. So I'm like, I've been there. It's awesome. And you have to be in that city once.
And this term I only have two seniors in an advanced class, but we're reading Livy's History of Rome, or a small part of it, and we're starting with the early history. So I've almost every 5 lines there's something referred to that some place in Rome or that they actually stood on during the trip. So I think that's sort of exciting for them, and again, it provides this context.
I didn't really feel immersed in Italian culture. Like, if anything, I felt more immersed in Roman culture just because during the whole trip I know personally, I learned maybe 2 words of Italian, grazie and ciao. So, but it was really interesting. I think that instead of like being immersed in Italian culture, the more important part to me about the trip was being immersed in Roman culture and seeing Roman things. So it was more for me like a trip back to Rome rather than a trip to Italy.
Well, it's like the springboard into my college classics career, which I don't know how long it's going to last, but I'm probably going to kind of ease into classics at the beginning of college. Probably not going to stay with it the whole way. Maybe. Who knows? You know, who knows what's going to happen? But I'm definitely more excited to go into it now and to have something kind of that I'm comfortable with to go into in college. Now that I've been on a trip and now that I've been supposed to customer.
Planning to live there in the future, so there is an impact. And I think one other thing is before this trip, I never really had an appreciation for visual art as much. I've always thought, wow, like that's really well done. You know, I've never really felt anything really strongly about it, but some of those sculptures, like Bernini, damn, like that guy is brilliant. And the ceiling, like I said, you know, like there are just some that like really stand out to me. I remember in the Sistine Chapel on the sides they have the prophets, and there was one of Daniel holding a book like this, and that just popped out to me. And so I definitely got interested in that too. Like, you know, learn to appreciate it more. Maybe because it was in a context that I was more familiar with.
Yeah, I was really interested in classics as a kid, and I liked Greek mythology. And that segued into Latin, and then at Phillips Exeter I took Latin and Greek, and that really, you know, things came alive, and I was very interested in it and continued with it at University of Pennsylvania. And as a classics student, I did a study abroad semester in Rome, and that, you know, further got my interest going, and then went to graduate school at the University of Texas in Austin, where I did classical archaeology. But within a classics department. Sometimes they're in art history departments or you know, anthropology and so forth. But this was classical archaeology, and just kept on doing it. But was very interested in being in Rome. So I got a Fulbright scholarship. I was a fellow at the American Academy, and was able to do a lot of first-hand research, which is what you want to do for your dissertation, and continue with that. And then ultimately saw a lot of opportunities, saw a lot of things that needed to be done. And so I co-founded an institute which I'd been running for about 10 years. It's called the American Institute for Roman Culture. And our mission is to promote and defend Rome's, and really Italy's, cultural heritage. And what we've segued into is not just study abroad programs, conservation projects, and excavations, all, you know, teaching students, all field work projects, but also collaborating with the Ministry of Culture, producing videos, working in social media to get people more involved and get more people participating on a worldwide scale. So we're dialoguing with many different groups, traveling back and forth from the United States and to Italy, but we're going also to Tunisia, we're going to Greece, and the more that we can talk with colleagues from around the world in the different walks of life, conservation, anthropology, history, art history, archaeology, classical languages, then these things are all coming together and all of these aspects come alive. And what we're doing is then preserving history and making history engaging. And we know how, you know, this, you know, your generation, it's really important that we keep this interest going and utilize the technologies that are that people are utilizing, social media, video, to reach out and then use it as a starting point to make this material more accessible, through which then you can do more research and learn more and study.
The classics of Greece and Rome are probably read more now than ever before for the appreciation and enjoyment of their literary values, but they are read largely in translation. There are still many of our boys who enjoy the labor of reading these classics in the original. It is hard work, but the work is rewarding to those who are really interested in literature. It is obvious that students electing Greek in this period have often been motivated solely by the desire to know something about Greece, the language, literature, and history, apart from such considerations as character building and college admission. Greek still has a valid and valuable place in the curriculum of the academy, so long as the tradition of Western thought remains alive in American education. Greek ideas will remain alive, and Greek will need to be taught here.
It comes and goes. There are periods when it was more popular and less popular, so it's a cyclical thing. I think it'll come back someday too. But I know certainly, yes, classics is not on the top of people's lists right now. But certainly learning Latin and Greek is a great preparation for all sorts of careers, because it does teach you a lot of things about memory and you being able to use other parts of your brain that otherwise you might not use. And it's great for developing language skills and so forth. So I think it's going to come back. But right now, it's just going through a tough time. I think it's also key in it is finding new ways to make it interesting to people, not just the dry stones and bones approach, but getting into sort of new techniques and technologies. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean all the time we look at we look at what's going on into contemporary culture and we see parallels. I mean there's no one-to-one of course, but you look at issues in America or issues that are going on with the world, economics or religion or social habits and how things are changing, and you can find parallels. You can see these things that happened before. That's the beauty, the importance of looking at history and valuing history and valuing that research that continues of the past cultures. It's important to maintain and understand what they did and always learn further what they did. It makes an understanding of our own contemporary society more meaningful, and that's really that interaction between past, present, and even future.